Hey y'all, my name is Novella and I am the host of Bootstrap Journey. And I wanted to talk to you tonight about grief because it's a topic that keeps coming up. Over the past 3 years, it seems like I am surrounded by grief, and I'm sure that many other people feel that way as well. But the tricky thing about grief is that some of us lost someone who was an abuser to us, and I can definitely relate to that. And that is probably the most complex form of grief that we will ever experience. For me, that was the death of my mother. She was an addict. She had borderline personality disorder and she had major narcissistic tendencies. So she was very abusive to me growing up. She allowed other people to abuse me. She was abusive as far as mentally, physically, and even spiritually, sometimes financially. And she allowed men to do pretty horrific things to me. So for many years, we had this convoluted relationship. I desperately wanted her to be a mother, and she desperately wanted freedom. She just didn't want to be a mother unless it was somehow gaining her some sort of attention or affirmation. If it wasn't benefiting her, she wanted nothing to do with me. And she was in and out of my life from the time that I was born. I was put up for adoption twice, and she would drop me off at my grandparents' home for months or years at a time and then show back up like nothing happened. So I have a lot of deep abandonment issues because of my interaction with my mother. And when she passed away, it was like the abandonment deepened somehow, because that little girl inside of me, that hurting little girl that desperately wanted her mother's love and affection and approval, was still hurting when my mother passed. And for years before she died, I always assumed that once she died, suddenly everything would be okay and I would experience freedom and I would no longer be hurting or traumatized from the things that she put me through. And that's absolutely not the truth. And if you have an interaction with your abuser and they have passed away, then you can relate to that. The pain is still there, the nightmares still happen, the triggers still come up and cause me to have panic attacks or throw me into this downward spiral that leave me in a deep depression that I have to battle my way out of. And it sucks. It's horrible. You know, these people these toxic people inflict all this pain and damage on us and they move on and we're left here bleeding. I say this a lot. What happened to you is not your fault, but your healing is your responsibility. And it's hard. There's nothing easy about it. It's so complex and confusing and frustrating and discouraging. And healing is not linear. We have ups and downs, and you'll take one step forward and four steps backwards. And then one day you'll look back and you'll realize you've had such tremendous progress that it's mind blowing. And then you'll start feeling like you're the damaged one. I asked my therapist for years if I had borderline personality disorder, but we tend to develop negative character defects from the treatment that we are in or under for years at a time. Your brain can't help but to take all that on. So, the point of this is that, and I'm still unraveling codependency at this point. It took me years to even realize that I was codependent. But when you are in a long term relationship with a narcissist, they mold you to become a codependent person because they want you fully reliant on them, but truly they rely on you. Like you are their fulfillment, Um, Everything they need and want, they are drawing that out of you, even when it sucks you dry. They will just keep pulling and pulling and pulling. But especially if you are a long-term partner with a narcissist, or if you are the child of a narcissist, they definitely will work double overtime to make sure that you develop codependency. And that's a way of them having their hooks in you. That's the way that they control you. So I'm still unraveling all of that, even though my mother passed away in 2016. But even once I drew those hard lines with my mother, I set very hard boundaries with her, and I went no contact for a very long time. I was still ending up in toxic, unhealthy relationships because I hadn't dealt with those underlying thoughts, beliefs about myself that I had taken on from the abuse. But I mention all of this so that you know that I understand a little better when I say that the the grief from her death is very complex. For years, like I said, I thought that I would be free, and it ended up opening up this whole new can of worms. I felt like this orphan child that had been freshly abandoned because for years, even though I had set hard boundaries and went no contact with her, I still had at the back of my mind this hope that someday I would have this beautiful relationship with my mother. She would suddenly be a loving, nurturing mother to me. And what an unrealistic hope that was. And the Bible tells us that hope deferred leaves the heart sick. Oh, man, did it leave me sick to not have that fulfilled. And I was constantly chasing after that desire for that fulfillment, to have my mother acknowledge me, to have my mother be a mother. And not only was I chasing it in her, I was chasing it in other people as well. It's just this brokenness that comes to us whenever our mothers can't be mothers. It's very unfortunate, but it's something that we can heal from and we can rise above. It just takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of um, patience and being willing to process through that pain and unraveling those distorted beliefs. It still hurt when she died. It still hurt. And that baffled me. That was so confusing. I was like, why is this hurting so bad? When all she ever did was hurt me and use me and control me, and she broke me multiple times. If I had reached a point as a teenager where she thought that I was breaking free and starting to be an individual and stand on my own, she would go out of her way to break me back down. And yet I loved her. She was my mother, you know? And I also held on to this belief that someday, before she died, she would have this epiphany that she was a horrific person and that she treated me like crap. I held on to this thought that one day she would come to me and she would pour out all of this regret, and she would apologize to me for everything she had ever done and all the damage she inflicted on me, and that I would be able to forgive her because I would have closure. But I can tell you from my own life, closure is a myth. It's not a real thing. I've had narcissistic exes come to me and apologize for everything they ever did to me, and their apology was a manipulation. But when they apologized and said, I realize now that you were an amazing woman and that I lost something incredible whenever I hurt you and let you go, you think that when they come back and say that, it would like heal up that wound, right? It doesn't. The only thing that heals these wounds is doing the work, putting in that effort, looking at things from a clear, authentic, raw, vulnerable perspective. Closure's a myth. Now, I noticed that people had two reactions to my grief for my mother. The first reaction was, don't you speak ill of the dead, because somehow when someone dies, they're suddenly a saint, and everything they ever did in this life was wiped away. That is such a ludicrous thought to have. That is a ridiculous belief. And it infuriates me because to tell me that I can't talk about the pain that I endured from this woman is saying that now we can't speak about the trauma is essentially the equivalent of telling a rape victim that their rapist has more rights than they do. And I know I just gave you something really harsh, but this is a very harsh situation. It's a harsh reality. And ultimately, when you're telling someone that they can't talk about their pain or their trauma because now the abuser's dead, you're gaslighting them. So when people come to me with that, miss me with that, boo-boo, because no, you ain't pulling up and parking that here. No, not even accepting that. And the opposite of what they do for that is like they're astonished that I am hurting that my mother's gone. They're shocked that I have that grief. Well, I'm right there with you. I'm shocked too. Um, it's confusing and it's hard to navigate sometimes. And when you have that level of pain from this person, and now you're hurting because they're gone, and you start to remember good things about them, so you miss those good times, it's so confusing. It's like being gaslit all over again, in a completely different perspective. It's like you're gaslighting yourself, because I'm like, oh, she had good times, she was a great dancer. She gave me my love of music, and she was an incredible writer, and because of her, I'm a writer. There's a balance, because no matter how toxic someone is, they're still a human being. I'm sure even Hitler had one or two good qualities somewhere deep down. I mean, he did get married, so surely his wife saw something in him, you know? And if they had absolutely no good qualities at all, they wouldn't be able to charm people the way that they do. So that's another thing you have to kind of work through. There's so many layers, and I used to get frustrated because I would feel like I got to a good point where I was more stable and secure and I was feeling peace, and then all this stuff would come up, and it was like a whole new layer of pain and things that I needed to deal with. But God had to show me that if it was all poured out on me at once, there's no way that I could handle it, for one. And number two, if I got overwhelmed by it, I would probably give up and not pursue the healing process at all. So He gives us what we can handle. He gives us what we need to address at this point in time. So if you heal layer one, well, then you go up to layer two, and that starts to come out. And so you have to process through that. He's not gonna give us a tsunami, and sometimes I would ask for it. I would say, well, I just want to be healed all at once. I want all of it to come now. I don't want to keep dealing with this for years on end. But honestly, looking back, I'm grateful that it has been a step-by-step process, because I mean the abuse itself was horrific. And I don't want the healing process to feel like it's abuse as well. So, bottom line is, do not allow people to dictate how your pain should be handled or processed after your abuser passes. Your pain is still very real and it's valid. And you are allowed to express your pain. You're allowed to express your frustration, your anger, maybe even your hatred for that person. And you're allowed to process through that. And you are also allowed to be hurt that the person's gone. Again, it's the most confusing thing in the world. But I think that mostly we miss the potential. We thought this person was something completely different, and that's who we loved, was the mask, the facade that they put on for the world to see. And we always believed that if we were good enough, and if we did enough, and we made them happy enough, then they would fulfill who we thought they were. And then once they pass, it's like that opportunity for them to fulfill it is gone forever. It also kind of gives you an opportunity to wake up to the fact that that's not who they were. They showed you repeatedly who they were, and we kept trying to paint them differently. And emotions are not negative. Well, so we deem emotions positive or negative, right? And I'm not telling you there are many things that you can do to process the complex feelings that you are going through. The first thing, and possibly the most crucial element in the healing process itself, is awareness. When you are aware of your emotional state, you gain control of it much more quickly. And most of us have been in those situations where we're just kind of letting our thoughts flow through our head. And then before we know it, they have this snowball effect, and we end up in this downward spiral and land in a very dark place. And we're like, oh, how did I get here? Why am I so angry right now? Or why am I so depressed right now? Crying my eyes out, nothing happened, but it was your thoughts. Your thoughts took you there, and the Bible tells us to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. But if we are not aware of our thoughts and we're just allowing them to run rampant in our heads, then you are not taking your thoughts captive. Your thoughts are taking you captive. And I'm not saying suppress or ignore your emotions. I'm not saying that at all, because God gave us emotions for a reason. Our emotions always point to something. If we feel fear, that means we need to be on high alert because we're possibly in danger, right? If you feel sadness, that means something bad has happened. If you feel anger, maybe there's an injustice. Maybe you need to stand for justification. These are just very light examples, but I'm sure they hit home for you. So I'm not saying get rid of your emotions, suppress them, ignore them. I'm not saying anything like that. I'm just saying don't unpack and live there. Yeah, you can hurt. Yeah, you can be sad. Yeah, you can miss someone. You can be angry. Feel the whole gamut of emotions. Feel all of them. Just don't unpack and live there. Don't get stuck there. And one of the trickiest things about healing is learning to get your thoughts or your feelings to process logically. Because when we've experienced intense trauma or long-term trauma, our corpus callosum, which is in the center of your brain and it connects the two halves of your brain, it does not transition an emotion over to the logical part of your brain. So one half of your brain processes situations, thoughts, feelings, ideas, it processes them logically and rationally. And then the other part is pure, raw emotion. It's almost animalistic. And if your corpus callosum has shut down due to trauma, then you get stuck in one side or the other. So either you are overly emotional or completely detached. But learning to wake that up and connect the two sides helps you to process through emotions in a much healthier, more stable way. One way that you can do this, well, again, awareness is key. So if you're catching yourself being triggered, if you catch yourself spiraling, something very, very simple that I love to do is deep breathing. And it sounds ridiculous to most people, but it takes you out of that emotion. Or, if you are envisioning a situation in your mind, have you ever envisioned an argument with someone and you're like, well, I'm going to say this. And then when they respond this, then I'm going to say this. And you can see it playing out in your head. Catch yourself, bring yourself back into this present moment. And listen, guys, this present moment is exactly where God is. He's not in the future or the past. He's right here, right now. So center yourself by deep breath in through your nose, out through your mouth. That is bringing your brain back into the present moment. It's helping you to focus. It's calming you. It's helping your muscles release all of that tension. So now we're here, right? And one thing that I find that works for me is something that's called EFT, Emotional Freedom Technique. It's also called tapping. And you can look up a lot of tapping videos on YouTube. One of them that I use is Brad Yates, and I'll put a link for one of his videos in this video. But tapping awakens the corpus callosum and helps you to process those thoughts from the animalistic feeling over into the logic. And then it comes back. And then it helps you over time as you consistently do it. It helps you to build new neural pathways, which gives you a different perspective of the world and of your situations and of yourself. When you're processing through these things, when you're tapping, you'll start with the actual negative thought. So for me, one of my biggest negative beliefs was I'm not good enough. So I would start with that, and I need to process that through in a logical way and then create a new neural pathway of the positive belief that I am enough. I am more than enough because I have Jireh, Jehovah Jireh, who is more than enough. He is enough. But I am enough because I am chosen by God. So there are many different modalities that are very effective, and I encourage you to try a few, find out what works for you. You are a unique individual, so what works for me may not work for you, but definitely start trying a few things and don't give up on them after the first try. Like you try to sit down and meditate in a space of God's presence and it doesn't work the first time. So you're like, that don't work for me. Meditation's stupid. And I hear a lot of people say that, but it takes time and you have to give it a chance, and we have to retrain our brains. Another simple way of doing this is by walking. And the rhythm of walking somehow connects the two sides of our brains and engages the corpus callosum so that we can generate new neural pathways. And it used to be believed by scientists that after you reach the age of, I think it was 22, like you were done. You were done developing, your brain was set at where it was, and that was that. You just had to accept where you were. But they have realized in the past decade or so that isn't true. We can create new neural pathways until the day we die. We can fire new synapses. We can do amazing things with this incredible brain that God gave us. Um, so I really hope that you'll look into a few of these things. I hope that I was able to make you feel heard. If you happen to be grieving the loss of someone who hurt you really badly, and I'm sorry that you were hurt like that. Thank you so much for joining me today, and make sure you are kind to you.